Welcome to the channel. I'm your host, Brian Toohey. This is Think Outside the Board, and today I'm doing a first impressions video on Venice from Braincrack Games. Now, Braincrack is a new imprint. They kickstarted a game a couple of years ago called Ragusa, which I backed and I really like. It's a great game. I guess we'll find out what I think about Venice shortly. But it is co-designed by Andrei Novak and David Turksey. Now, Andrei Novak, I'll put a few of his games up here on the screen for you to see, but he hasn't worked on anything that's incredibly popular. David Turksey, however, has worked on a ton of stuff. So he's designed some of those heavy T games you may know, like Tawantinsuyu and Tekenyu. He's done some real-time games like Kitchen Rush. He's done lighter games like Dice Settlers, and he's worked on some really heavy games like Anachrony and the upcoming Perseverance Castaway Chronicles. And I think David Turksey is one of the best designers working today. I really love his work, and more I'm wanting to just get all of his games. He's a personal favorite of mine, so I was super excited to back Venice. Now, Braincrack has another game that's going to be coming to Kickstarter very soon called Florence, and all three of these games, Ragusa, Venice, and Florence, have similar box art and similar kind of design styles. In fact, the artist who worked on Venice, Bartłomiej Rozniak, also worked on Ragusa, and I believe he's also working on Florence. So they've got this in-house art look that's becoming very consistent from game to game. The game is a medium-heavy game. It plays 1 to 5 players, and it's a worker placement game, but it's got a lot of other things going on in it. Some mechanics that are very specific to this game. So let me show you those mechanics and how the game works, and then I'll talk about what I thought about the game after one play. Again, because this is a first impressions video, not a full teach, and I'm just going to give you some quick thoughts about the game rather than a full review. So first off, I wanted to show you the board, and this is the way the board is going to be set up for any game. These 3 buildings here, St. Mark's Square, the Major Council, and the Doge's Palace, these are always on the board. They are printed on the board. However, there are 12 other buildings here, and as you can see, these are tiles, and so they're going to be randomly distributed in any game. They'll be in a different place every game. And one of the coolest aspects of the game is how these buildings work. So as you can see, they're divided into 4 different sections. The first time that you place an assistant there, you're going to place that assistant on the top of the tile, and you will get to do the action shown below. So in this case, you'd get an orange cube. Then every time you go to the building in the future, you will get to advance this assistant. And then whenever you trigger them, either on that turn where you just advance them, or when you move your boat by. So you'll get to trigger your assistants as your boats go by that location. You'll be able to trigger the location at the top of the tile, and then all the locations to where your assistant is. So if my assistant's here in the second spot, I'll be able to take a cube and then get 2 scrolls. If I had advanced my assistant over here, then anytime I visit this tile or pass by the tile, I'll be able to get an orange cube, take 2 scrolls, get an intrigue card, and get 2 victory points. So this is kind of an engine building situation where you're going to be placing your assistants at buildings and advancing them. And the later you get in the game, the more actions you're going to be able to take every time you even pass by a building. So by the end of this game, it's a pretty complex game where one move could have you passing by several different buildings and triggering several different actions on each building. Now, you've got a victory point tracker that goes around the outside of the board here. And the last thing I probably should mention before I go to a tighter shot is this Major Council over here. Now I have this set up right now for a 3-player game, which means this token is going to go here on the 12 spot. And every player is going to have a token on this track. Now there are some actions that you can take on the board, mainly at the Major Council, which is one of these buildings that's pre-printed on here, so it's going to be in the same place every game. And the Minor Council can do it. It has this action over here, where you'll be able to move this token, this player token, up this track. One of the ways that the endgame can be triggered is when any player token gets to or passes this endgame piece. That's actually what that's called. That's called the endgame piece. And if a player moves up to meet this token will move over here to this spot, and players will complete the round that they're currently playing. Then they'll play a penultimate round, and they will play a final round. So as soon as one player's token catches that endgame piece, you'll finish the round and you'll play 2 more rounds. And the reason I mention this track, it's hard to promote yourself along this track. But if you do, at the end of the game here, players are going to get some significant points for whoever's in the lead. Another little thing on the board here that I'm going to show you while I still kind of have it zoomed out like this. There's a big marker right here which tells you that the first player to place all 10 of their assistants out on the board is going to get 8 victory points. Anyway, this is the main part of the board, but to show you the rest of the game, I'm going to kind of go in smaller. I'm going to show you the player board in detail, and then I'll show you kind of how a turn works and how these gondolas work. All right, so next let's look at this player board. And it has the steps of a player turn written right on it. So the first thing that you can do is play an influence card, if you already have one. And these are not necessarily easy to come by, but there's ways that you can get them from the various buildings. If you have them, it might look something like this, and it might have some kind of one-time ability that you can use. So that's the first thing that you'll do if you have an influence card already in your hand that you can use. It's basically just gives you bonus actions. It's a nice way to do a little something extra on your turn. Then you're going to move your gondolier. Now, you always have to switch your gondolier to another boat. And that creates some problems in this game because the gondoliers don't really sit that well in the boat. You can keep them in the same boat, but to do that you have to pay 3 money. So in general, the game is incentivizing you to move your gondolier every turn from one boat to the other. And the fact that you have 2 different boats on the board, it gives you some variability in terms of where you can go. It also gives you a little bit of a puzzle to figure out when you're constantly being pushed between your 2 boats. So you may need to do something one turn that's in an area of the board where your boat is, and you may need to wait until a later turn to be able to access on the other side of the board where your other boat is. So you'll be alternating your gondoliers each turn generally. Then you'll move your boat. Now, there is this little token called a movement token. It looks like a little wave. And when you move your boat, you're going to place this on the first set of coins on the board in front of your boat. You won't have to pay that amount. Then you can move the boat as far as you want, but you're going to have to pay coins for every coin icon that you go over. There are both groups of 1 coin and 2 coins on the board, so each time you pass those icons, you're going to have to pay that amount. I'm going to explain how the boats move and how the buildings trigger in just a minute after I've finished discussing this player board. But you'll be moving your manned boat as that third part of your turn, and you'll be resolving any gondola meetings and any past buildings as you do. The fourth thing you'll do is you'll hand in a mission, and there are a certain number of missions here, depending on player count. For a 3-player game, each player will get 3 of the mission cards and pick 2, and then the one that they don't choose will go back at the bottom of the mission stack. And there'll be ways to get more missions as the game goes on. But the fourth thing you can do is you can hand in a mission. Generally, that involves going to a certain location printed on the card with the colored cubes that are pictured on the card, and then you'll get a certain amount of victory points and a certain amount of money. Sometimes you may also have to pay something else like a scroll to be able to do this. Once you've done that, every card has an ongoing player ability, and this is kind of the neat part of the engine building of the game. So every time after you've done a delivery and handed in a mission, you can then take this card, slide it under your player board, and you will then have access to that player ability ongoing for the rest of the game. Now you have space for 3 of these cards, which means if you get to the point where you're handing in a 4th mission and beyond, you can still slide it under here and get a new ongoing player power, But to do that, you'll have to remove one of the cards that's already there, and you'll just put that over to the right side of your player board. And the reason you'll do that is so that at the end of the game, you can still count up all of your victory points. Now, also on the player board, you'll be tracking scrolls and intrigue. Scrolls are generally a good thing. Intrigue is generally a bad thing, but you will often need intrigue to do certain things on the board. Sometimes you'll be able to exchange intrigue for cubes or scrolls or things that are powerful, victory points. But you can see on this track that if you ever get past this 8 intrigue space, every time you bump past that, you're going to lose 2 victory points. And then at the end of the game, there's a mechanic with the intrigue that's extremely unforgiving, where you can spend 2 scrolls to remove 1 intrigue, or 4 money to remove 1 intrigue. At that point, once you've removed all the intrigue that you can, the player that still has the most intrigue remaining, that player's out of the game. They can't score, they can't win, they just automatically lose. For some players, this may be such a prohibitive mechanic that they may not want to play the game, but you absolutely should know that going in. So if you want to be able to compete at the end of the game for the winning spot of this game, you need to have 0 intrigue, or at the very least, you need to have less intrigue than one of the other players. So whoever has the most intrigue will just be out of the game, gone, period, completely. So this is a very important thing to be aware of and to watch. You can bump it up during the game if you want to be able to exchange it for other important things. But by the end of the game, this really needs to be reduced down to 0, or as far down as you can possibly get. Certainly less than at least one of the other players in your game. Okay, so let me show you how the boats work. Now, if this was my turn and I was moving this boat, I would take this movement token right here, and I'm going to place it over the first coins that I'm going to be going over, and I won't have to pay that cost. Now, for this turn, I'm going to go from here all the way over to this spot, which means I have to go through these coins, this coin, and this coin. So to do this, I'm going to end up having to pay 4 coins. That will eventually get me over here where my turn will end. There's that gondolier falling out of the boat. But let's talk about what happens as I go over to this. So if I've got my little boat here, and I go by a building where I already have an assistant, I'm going to get to activate that assistant. That means that I can activate every space on the building starting from the top, essentially noon, and traveling around what's the clock face of the building until I get to the space where my assistant is, and I can activate that space as well. So for this building, I'll be able to activate the top space and the right space. The top space will get me this gray cube, and the bottom space down here will get me an intrigue and a coin. Now, when I'm doing this, I can skip over spaces if I wanted to, but I can't do partial actions. So for instance, if I'm going to do this, I have to do both of these things. It's either all or nothing. But I could, for instance, skip getting the gray cube and then just do that. Or I could get the gray cube and then skip doing that. But you're going to get to do any actions on this tile, including and up to where your assistant is. Now, I would do the same thing when I went by this boat. I would get to trigger 3 spaces here. When I'm passing an opponent's boat, something interesting will happen. It's called a gondola meeting. And this is something that will affect both me and the player that I'm passing by. Each one of us will have to decide whether we want to lose a scroll from our player board or gain an intrigue. So we'll each have to do that anytime a boat passes another player's boat. As I'm passing this boat here, my own boat, I can freely exchange resources between the boats. So if I have cubes in here and cubes in here, I can exchange them back and forth as much as I want and get them organized however I want. But there's also another rule in passing a building where I have my boat docked. I can't trigger that assistant. So I don't get to trigger him because my boat's already there. Then, when I finally get over into this last space, my destination, which is in this case is the library, If I didn't have an assistant there, I would get to place an assistant in this top spot. But because in this example, I already have one here, I'm able to promote this assistant to the next spot. So I would move that assistant over into the fourth space here on this tile, and then I would get to activate all of the areas on the tile in order, starting at the top, going clockwise kind of around the tile. So that's how a turn works. That's how the boat moves. That's how you activate buildings and assistants as you pass by, but not where your boat is. And that's how boat meetings work with other players. And all of this just creates a really cool, really complex little puzzle where as you're moving along, you're getting to do a lot of different things. And it gets more complex as the game goes on and players have their assistants distributed throughout a lot of those buildings. Now, the end of the game is going to get triggered whenever these mission cards run out. And in a 3-player game, you're going to start with 13 of these, but each player will get 3 and then choose 2, which means you'll have 6 of these 13 mission cards out to the players, 2 to each player, which means you'll have 7 cards left in this deck. So as soon as these 7 cards are gone, as soon as players have claimed these, that will trigger the end game. The other way the end game can be triggered is if a player is able to catch this token that we talked about a little bit earlier. In either case, you're going to finish the current round and play 2 more rounds. And then, whichever player is highest on this major council track will get points down here depending on the player count. So in a 2-player game, the player in the lead will get 9 points. In a 3-player game, 12, and in a 4 to 5-player game, 14 points. That's a pretty significant chunk of points. So that's something to be aware of. It is a little difficult to trigger endgame. The mission cards don't go that quickly, and ascending up this council track is even slower. And then another thing to be aware of is the chunk of points that this player will get who is at the top of this track that will give them a huge advantage. And also being aware of that intrigue, because if you are the player with the most intrigue, that may just immediately stop you from even being able to score. So that's something that you should be aware of, because depending on you and the player that you are, that may or may not affect your ability to enjoy the game. One last thing that I should mention, every player has 2 of these bridges. They look pretty cool. They're screen printed like a lot of the components. The components in the game are very nice. But every player is going to have 2 of these bridges, and at some point in the game, if they go to this major council location, they'll be able to build a bridge. Now, when they build a bridge, they'll pick a place where there are coins on the board, and they can just build that bridge over those coins. What that means is that whenever any player passes by this bridge in the future, they're not going to have to pay that coin fee. When the player that owns the bridge passes by the bridge, in fact, they're going to gain a coin. And when any other player passes by the purple player's bridge, those other players will gain an intrigue. So they won't have to pay the coin cost that they normally would, but instead they're going to gain an intrigue. And as we said before, intrigue is generally bad, and by the end of the game, it can be terrible. So you kind of want to avoid that. Now, the bridges are very specific to this location, so it's entirely possible that you could play this game once or even several times, and the bridges may not even come out. But if they do, that's how they work. They just make things a little bit easier for all players in terms of the movement, and they reward the player that built it with a coin every time they pass by, while punishing the other players with intrigue. So I mentioned at the top that David Turksey is a favorite designer of mine, and Venice is a game that I went into wanting to love, and I still really, really want to love the game. I really like the way the canal mechanic works, and the way that you can trigger the different buildings, and the way that your assistants are kind of moving up the buildings to more powerful places. And then when you trigger those assistants, you get to do all of the actions on the tile. All of that stuff feels like Eurogamer heaven. There's just so many good mechanics in it. And it's kind of it's a medium heavy game, but it's on the lighter side of a medium heavy game. It feels very approachable and something that you could get kind of all levels of gamer playing, from more complex gamers to lighter gamers. But there are some problems with the game, some big problems, I think, that really could have been fixed in production with different production choices. So one of those problems are the gondoliers themselves and the little boats. So there's this mechanic in Venice where every time you take a new turn, you're going to be alternating your gondolier from one boat to the other. You can keep them in the same boat, but you have to pay a little tax. So the game is kind of geared generally towards you switching the gondolier every turn and making decisions based on kind of having to do that. The problem is that the boats are a little bit warped. And I don't think it's just my copy. It just seems to be the design of the boats. They're a little bit warped. It may even be intentional to give them a little bit of a feeling of kind of like a canoe almost, just a little bit of a bend to the boat. The problem there is the gondoliers don't really stand in the boat very well. Once you get them positioned, it's not a huge problem, but it becomes a problem when you have to move that gondolier every turn. And every player is going to be moving that gondolier every turn, except in the instances where they pay that tax to keep them in the boat. And that doesn't happen that often. So each time you move that gondolier from one boat to the other, he tips and falls, and then you'll right him, and then you go to move your boat, and usually he'll tip and fall again. So a lot of the game becomes just dealing with these tipsy gondoliers. Also on the bottom of the boat are these kind of marked raised lines, these kind of striations. And I think that they would have been a really good design implementation if they would have been placed in such a way that they would kind of create dividing lines between where the 5 cubes sit in your boat, because you can hold a maximum of 5 cubes. But they're not. They're not in these kind of dividing lines. They're in sort of in between the dividing lines. They're almost where you place the cubes. So once you get a few cubes in the boat, it starts to become a problem because they start to stick in certain places, and then to move them over, it just becomes kind of like this fiddly nightmare. And it could have been very easily fixed with different boats. So 2 of my problems with the game are with the design, the physical design of the boats. The third one is with the tiles. So you could see, as I was showing you the game and the board and the tiles all have the name of each building at the top. The problem is once you start placing multiple assistants on there, you need to be able to see, the names of the buildings. And if you're playing a 2-player game, you need to see that every turn, because each time a player takes their turn, they're going to have to follow with moving an AI boat. And when they do that, they sort of pull a card and then they have to move it to a specific building. It's hard to find those buildings on the board, especially as it gets later and later in the game and the buildings become filled with assistants. I think that could have been remedied by placing the name of the building on each of the tile's 4 sides instead of just on one side. That way, no matter where you're sitting and where the assistants are, you could at least see the name on the side that's closest to you. At the very least, they could have done something like put it on the bottom of the tile rather on the top, so that if you're looking at it kind of from the front direction, you'd actually be able to read the name of the building. Now, none of these 3 things is a terrible thing, but together they create these 3 circumstances that you're just always dealing with and completely takes you out of the game. It probably increases the playtime of the game substantially just because you're constantly dealing with these 3 things. And it's an annoyance that shouldn't really affect the game. But it does. It does because it's so prevalent in the way that it affects gameplay. And it's really frustrating, I think, because this game is a really good game. It's a really well-designed, solid game that I think is a lot of fun and offers really good gameplay choices. But these physical components are going to be forever a problem. I really want them to just go out and make a second version of the game and correct these things. It also occupies this place in the board game space of medium weight games that can kind of appeal to a wider group of gamers. That is where a lot of other games sit. I believe when you're looking to play a game of the kind of type and weight of Venice, you have a lot of choices, which means that if it has this many problems with its physical components, people are going to grab for something else that's just doesn't have that kind of prohibitive element to it. And I'm going to have to see over time where I land with Venice, whether I think I have so many other games like that. that the production element problems are big enough that I end up just getting rid of the game because it's more trouble than it's worth. If I decide to hold on to the game, I think I'll probably end up talking to a friend who has a 3D printer and maybe trying to print different 3D boats. But that's not a ringing endorsement of a game, and you don't really want to have to go and do these other things on the side like 3D print new components just to make the game playable and functional. So that puts me in a really weird space in terms of recommending or not recommending Venice, because I think the game itself and the design and the mechanics are really, really good, and I really like the game. And I think if it didn't have those physical issues, I'd probably rate the game around an 8.5. But those problems have dinged it back to a 7, which for me is kind of in that place where it may not end up getting played as much. I think Ragusa, Braincrack's first game, doesn't have those problems. I think it's very well designed for what it is. I hope their next game, Florence, doesn't have those problems either. But Venice for me is going to sit in this place where I have this kind of tough choice sitting in the back of my mind. Do I try to fix the game on my own? Do I sell it? Or do I just accept its problems and then every time I play it, it's a bit of a fiddly nightmare for everyone playing the game. And even though I want to recommend the game and I like the gameplay, that's a tough situation to be in. So knowing the problems with the game, I think that is the decision that you have to make, whether the gameplay looks interesting enough that you're willing to deal with those issues. They should just be minor issues, but they kind of balloon up into bigger issues in this game. Or whether it's a pass for you. I think 3D printing new boats may help a lot, but then there's the issue of the tiles as well. So maybe it's a game you're going to want to seek out, give it a couple of plays, and then make a decision. But just know that the mechanics of the game are really solid, and it kind of hurts my heart if I'm going to have to give this one away or not play it, because it is a good, solid game I'd like to play again. So that for now is my take on Venice. If I come back later and I do a full review, I think I'll have a more definitive conclusion that I've reached at that point after playing it more and kind of letting it percolate in my subconscious a little bit and seeing where I stand on it. For now, I'm kind of sitting on this line. I like the gameplay. I like what the game does. Production-wise, it's got some problems. Thank you very much for watching this video. Thanks for spending some time with me and listening to what I have to say. If you haven't liked or subscribed yet, please consider doing that. And I will see you in the next video. Take care.